If you ever find yourself in conversation with a demographer, they will be confused by the four demographic transitions that I've presented here. I am thinking of humanity on a much deeper timescale than what is usually encompassed by the field of demography. A demographer will tell you that there is primarily just one demographic transition, and that it started about 200 years ago and continues. The demographic transition began with the Industrial Revolution. Initially, as industrialization increased, population size increased. With the insight provided by germ theory of disease came improved personal hygiene. With technological advances came improved food storage and transportation, and with those, improved nutrition. This was also a time when governments started to organize and fund biomedical research. All of these factors led to a decrease in mortality. People lived longer, and initially, people were having more children. But this didn't last long. In all cultures that experience an industrial revolution, there ultimately comes a time when birth rates dramatically decrease. Let's look at the rise in life expectancy first. So, for example, in the United States, in 1789, life expectancy was 37. In 1970, life expectancy was 70. And in 2014, life expectancy, oh, I misspelled it, sorry, was 79. This life expectancy in the United States is actually going down right now. So we're kind of in an odd trajectory, part of the trajectory. We don't quite as much accord with what's happening in other developed economies. So India, in 1920, the life expectancy was 24, and in 2003, life expectancy was 62. In China, 1950 to 55, life expectancy was 41, and 1995 to 1999, life expectancy had reached 70. Let's turn to some other data from the United Nations that shows this trend in a more of a comprehensive way based on economic development. Since we've just looked at anecdotal data here, let's look at sort of one by one. Let's look at more comprehensively. In this graph, developed means an increase in infrastructure, industrialization, standard of living, and household income. So on the x-axis, we have years going from 1950 on the left to 2050 estimated on the right. The time this was published was just after 2000, so that's why it has the dark line, the vertical line at 2000. On the y-axis, you have the average years lived. And you can see categories for more developed at the top, less developed in the middle, and least developed at the bottom. And notice that average years lived is increasing over time. So a general trend over time, life expectancy increases. Countries with the most economic development have the highest life expectancies. Now, let's look at what happens to fertility rates. So here we have those same years, 1950 to 2050, with the year 2000 marked in the center with the vertical line. And again, least developed, less developed, and more developed, but it's kind of the opposite here. Again, the y-axis marks births per woman. So this is your total fertility rate. And notice that it's kind of the opposite as what we saw before. Overall, for all three categories of economic development, total fertility rates are decreasing, but we saw that life expectancies were increasing in the previous graph, but that total fertility rates are decreasing the most for the least developed and the less developed, and just decreasing a little bit for the more developed. So we've seen these changes in fertility, and one of the things I find so fascinating about this is that in the countries that went into this industrialization and the demographic transition earlier is that they did so before there really was good birth control. So, for example, in most European provinces, fertility declined by about 40% between 1890 and 1920. And at the time, the main method of birth control was coitus interruptus, which is colloquially known as pulling out or pull and pray. So clearly, there were decisions about manipulating sexual behavior to alter the number of children, to reduce the number of children that people were having, long before this was actually a pretty simple thing to do. And why? Well, it's complicated. There's a huge amount of research in demography try to figure this out, try to answer this question. But it seems as though it's multifactorial, and in particular that there's a lot of values that are shifting. One is that there's an increasing value of non-agricultural goods, that there was an increasing value of education, an increasing survival of children. So women didn't need to have 6 children in order to have 2 survive to adulthood. More and more of your children would actually be expected to make it to adulthood. There's also an increasing economic value to women's time. So women were seen as being able to make money outside of their child rearing abilities, and that economic value was weighed against the time spent taking care of children. And also, there was an increasing cost for rearing children. Children became expensive to have, and in fact, today children are quite expensive in our culture to have. And so when you weigh all of these pieces together, there are clearly decisions being made to delay childbirth and to have fewer children. I mentioned that the demographic transition started about 200 years ago, but that it's not over. This tail end, or perhaps the tail end, or where we currently are in the demographic transition in this country and in these more economically developed countries, is something I want to show you some data for. So what's going on now? Here are some data showing age at first birth, the age that a woman is when she has her first child, looking at 1970 on the left-hand side of the x-axis and 2006 on the right side of that x-axis, and going from 0% to 100% at the top. And I want to really draw your attention to the difference between 1970 and 2006 for women who are under 20 years. Notice that 36% of women who were having their first birth were under 20 years of age in 1970. And contrast that to 2006, when only 21% of the women who were giving birth for the first time were under 20. And then move your eyes to the top of the graph. In 1970, fewer than 1% of the births for first births were women who were over the age of 35, and in 2006 it was 8%. So many women choosing to have their first child a bit later in life over just these 36 years. We can see this data broken down in a bit more detail on this graph. So you can see 35 and over from 2000, so it's kind of picking up from where that last graph left off. 2000 on the left, it goes from 7.4% to 9.1% of first births, the age of mother at her first birth. And notice that decrease just over the 14 years here of women who are giving birth for the first time under age 20, from 23% in 2000 to 13.4% in 2014. So quite a lot of shift going on in terms of age. But it's not just the United States. So we've been looking at United States data. Let me show you some data for other countries as well. selected countries, 1970 and 2006 being compared here. So it's the age of mother in years on the x-axis, and then you have the United States, Poland, Hungary, France, Canada, Finland, Denmark, Greece, Ireland, Italy, Sweden, Netherlands, Japan, and Switzerland. The average age of a mother at her the first time she gives birth in 1970 is marked by the dark blue, and in 2006 by the green color. For every single one of these countries, the age has increased substantially. In the United States, it went from 21 in 1970 to 25 in 2006. But look all the way down at the bottom of this graph to Switzerland. Age at first birth in 1970 was 25, and age at first birth in 2006, 29.4. And it isn't just sort of European Americans who are driving the trend in the United States. If we look at ethnicity here on this graph, you get the overall picture at the top, and then you can see for Asian or Pacific Islander, Cuban, non-Hispanic, white, Central and South America, Puerto Rican, non-Hispanic, Black, Mexican, and American Indian or Alaskan Native, that for all of these categories, these groups, these communities of women, there has been an increase in the age at which they have, on average, their first birth. So the demographic transition is still going on, and it is decreasing fertility. And one of the reasons these days that's happening is this decision to have children later, to delay childbirth. So let's summarize what we have been talking about across all of these demography videos. The key points to take home. Well, one is that our lineage's fertility has evolved over the last 5 million years. So if we think about Homo sapiens and thinking about our hunter-gatherer time and compare that to populations now that are in a state of natural fertility, we could pretty much assume that prior to the Neolithic, that Homo sapiens probably had an average total fertility rate of between 4 to 8, depending on the population. Quite reasonable way to think of that. The other thing to take away from all of this and the variation that we have seen is that there is no modern population that can serve as the one example of what human fertility is like today. That cultural variation, evolution, and modern influences on our biology result in a wide range of variation in human fertility. And our fertility practices are changing. That there's no set way to do it, no set way that we have done it, and I'm certain no set way that we always will.